What if I told you that the money in your savings account is designed to lose value? Not by accident, not due to a bug in the system, but by deliberate design. We are all taught to work hard, save our money, and watch it grow. But this fundamental belief rests on a fragile assumption that the money itself is a stable, reliable store of value. The truth is, the system we operate in today was born from a single, desperate decision made over 50 years ago. A decision that severed the last link between money and anything tangible, turning it into a tool of political power, and transforming inflation from a temporary economic fever into a permanent, silent weapon against your savings. This is the story of how that happened, and why the trap it created is more relevant today than ever before. To understand the weapon, you must first understand the world before it was unleashed. After the devastation of World War II, the world's leading economies gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, in 1944. Their goal was to create a new international economic order, one that would prevent the kind of instability that led to the war. The system they created was elegantly simple, and it placed the United States at the very center of the financial universe. The US dollar was declared the world's reserve currency. But it wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a promise. The US government guaranteed that every dollar was convertible to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Other major currencies, like the British pound, the German mark, and the Japanese yen, were then pegged to the US dollar. This was the Bretton Woods system. It created a world of perceived stability. The dollar was as good as gold, and for 2 decades, it worked. The post-war era saw an unprecedented economic boom, known as the Golden Age of capitalism. International trade flourished, economies rebuilt, and the American consumer became a global powerhouse. But this system contained a fatal flaw, a time bomb ticking away at its very foundation. The flaw was simple: the United States had to run the system, but it also had its own domestic priorities. By the 1960s, those priorities became very, very expensive. The nation was funding 2 wars simultaneously, the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and a very hot, very costly war in Vietnam. At the same time, President Lyndon B. Johnson launched his Great Society programs, a massive expansion of social welfare spending. The U.S. was writing checks that its gold reserves couldn't cash. The number of dollars circulating in the world began to vastly outnumber the gold sitting in Fort Knox to back them up. Other countries weren't blind to this. They could see the U.S. was printing money far beyond its means. Nations like France, led by a skeptical Charles de Gaulle, began to question the promise. They started showing up at the U.S. Treasury's doorstep and politely asking for their gold back in exchange for their excess dollars, as was their right under the Bretton Woods Agreement. The gold began to flow out of America. The promise that was once the source of its power was now becoming a crippling burden. The global financial system was straining at the seams, and the U.S. was facing a choice: either impose severe, politically suicidal austerity measures to save the dollar, or break the promise altogether. The breaking point arrived on a quiet Sunday, August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon convened a secret meeting with his top economic advisors at Camp David. The situation was critical. The British ambassador had just requested to convert $3 billion into gold, a sum that would have dangerously depleted U.S. reserves. That evening, Nixon went on national television and delivered a speech that would permanently alter the course of modern finance. He announced, and I quote, "I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets." The key word there was temporarily. But everyone knew what it really meant. The gold window was closed, and it would never reopen. In a single stroke, Nixon severed the last thread connecting the US dollar, and by extension, the entire global financial system, to a physical commodity. The dollar was no longer a claim on a bar of gold. It was now a claim on nothing but the full faith and credit of the United States government. Money had become pure fiat. An abstract concept backed only by decree. The discipline of gold was gone. The era of the printing press was about to begin. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Currency markets were thrown into turmoil. But the long-term consequences were far more profound. With the anchor of gold removed, there was no longer a hard limit on how much money the Federal Reserve could create. And so, the 1970s became a decade of rampant inflation. Prices for everything from gasoline to groceries skyrocketed. The phenomenon of stagflation, high inflation combined with stagnant economic growth and high unemployment, baffled economists. The value of the dollar plummeted. What had begun as a solution to a gold drain had unleashed a monster. This is the moment when inflation transformed. It was no longer just a consequence of an overheating economy. It became a permanent feature of the system. For governments, it became an invaluable, if insidious, tool. Why raise taxes, a politically unpopular move, when you can simply print the money you need to fund your spending? The public pays for it anyway, not through a direct tax, but through the slow, steady erosion of their purchasing power. Inflation became a silent, stealth tax on every person holding the currency. In that same 1971 speech, Nixon tried to treat the symptoms of the disease he was about to unleash. He imposed a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices. It was a classic attempt to solve a monetary problem with brute force regulation. Of course, it failed spectacularly. You cannot legislate away the laws of supply and demand. Once the controls were lifted, prices exploded upwards with even greater force, as all that newly created money chased the same amount of goods and services. The failed fixes of the 1970s proved a crucial point: when you treat the symptom, rising prices, instead of the cause, monetary expansion, you are doomed to fail. The problem wasn't that goods were becoming more expensive, it was that the money used to buy them was becoming less valuable. So, what does a decision made in 1971 have to do with your bank account today? Everything. The system Nixon created is the system we still live in. Since that day, the purchasing power of the US dollar has collapsed. A dollar from 1971 has the purchasing power of about 14 cents today. That represents a loss of over 85% of its value. This isn't a glitch. It is the system operating as designed. Central banks around the world now explicitly target an inflation rate of around 2% per year. This means they are actively aiming to devalue your savings by 2% every single year. They call it price stability, but it's a guaranteed loss of purchasing power. The trap is that by saving money in a standard bank account, you are on a treadmill, running to stand still, while the machine is actively programmed to move backwards. This system incentivizes debt and speculation over savings. Why save when your money loses value? It's better to borrow money today, spend it, and pay it back with cheaper, less valuable money in the future. The hidden weapon of inflation silently transfers wealth from savers to debtors, with the biggest debtor of all being the government itself. So, what can we take away from this journey? First, money is not a fixed law of nature. Its rules are man-made and can be changed overnight by a small group of people in a room. The promise of the Bretton Woods system lasted for 27 years before it was broken in a single speech. Second, the move to a pure fiat currency system gave governments unprecedented power to spend without the constraint of tangible assets. Inflation is the inevitable byproduct of that power, a stealth tax that is far less visible, and therefore far more politically palatable, than direct taxation. And third, in the current system, saving cash over the long term is a financially losing strategy. The hidden trap in your bank account is that your money's purchasing power is engineered to decline. Understanding this is the first step toward protecting yourself. The next time you hear about quantitative easing, stimulus packages, or massive government deficits, remember that it is not free money. The bill is paid silently, through the slow devaluation of the currency you work so hard to earn. The real question we must ask ourselves is not whether the system is working as intended, but how long a system built on a constantly depreciating asset can last before we reach another breaking point. If you found this look into our financial history eye-opening, subscribe for more deep dives into the systems that shape our world. And let me know in the comments, do you see inflation as a necessary evil for economic growth, or a deliberate weapon against the average person? Now, to understand the last time the world faced a crisis of this magnitude, check out our video on the Great Depression and the policies that followed. Thank you for watching.